Hello everybody and welcome to today's edition of the Daf Yomi. Today we're doing Masechet Tractate Menachot 93b, and this is a fascinating journey through the laws of sacrifices. This page in particular revolves around the increase of semikha, the placing of hand on the head of an offering. We will see how this seemingly simple act is a complex matter with deep implications. The main thrust of our discussion is to determine who is required to perform semikha. We will explore the Mishnah's ruling that if the owner of a sacrifice dies, his heir must perform the semikha, for he has inherited the obligation. The Gemara then brings a Baraita that appears to contradict this, and we will see the brilliance of the sages in resolving this apparent conflict, showing us how both rules can be reconciled. We will also delve into the question of whether a person can appoint an agent to perform semikha on their behalf. The discussion touches on the very nature of personal obligation representation. The Gemara concludes that his offering teaches us that only the owner himself can perform this act, as it is a personal expression of atonement and connection. The Daf concludes by bringing additional verses to teach us that only the owner of the offering can perform the semikha and not his wife or gentile. So let us begin, and may the light of the Torah illumine our path. So, just ending off from the last moment, a question was brought by the Gemara, and the Gemara asks, and according to the one who said that the exclusion of a blind person is derived from the burnt offering of appearance, what is the reason that he does not derive this from the placing of hands performed by the elders of the congregation? The Gemara answers, he holds that one derives the halachot of an offering of an individual from the halachot of another offering of an individual, such as the burnt offering of appearance. One does not derive the halacha of the offering of an individual from the halacha of communal offering, e.g. the bull bought for community-wide violation. The Gemara asks, and according to the one who said that the exclusion of a blind person derived from the placing of hands performed by the elders of the congregation, what is the reason that he does not derive it from the burnt offering of appearance? The Gemara answers, he holds that one derives a halachot of a matter concerning which requirements of placing hands is explicitly written with regard to the case itself, as is the case in the passage detailing the general requirement of placing hands, from another matter concerning which placing hands is also explicitly written with regard to that case itself, as is the case of the passage describing the bull brought for the community-wide violation of a sin. This serves to exclude the possibility of deriving the halachot from those of burnt offering of appearance, as a requirement to place hands upon it not explicitly written in the Torah with regard to it, but rather it itself is derived from the requirement stated with regard to a voluntary burnt offering. This is as the Tana taught in a Baraita in the presence of Rav Yitzchak bar Abba, with regard to the obligatory offering brought by Aaron the high priest on the 8th day of the inauguration of the tabernacle. It is written, when the burnt offering was presented, and he sacrificed in accordance with the ordinance, Leviticus 9:16. The last phrase means, in accordance with the ordinance of a voluntary burnt offering. Accordingly, this verse teaches about every obligatory burnt offering, including the burnt offering of appearance that requires placing hands, just as a voluntary burnt offering does. The Mishnah states, a Canaanite slave, the agent of the owner of the offering, who brings the offering on his behalf, and a woman do not place hands on the offering. Concerning these halachot, the sages taught the Baraita, the term his hand is mentioned 3 times in Leviticus chapter 3, which details the requirement of placing hands, each mention expounded to exclude a different case. His hand, Leviticus 3:2, but not the hand of his Canaanite slave. His hand, Leviticus 3:8, not the hand of his agent. His hand, Leviticus 3:13, but not the hand of his wife. So let's explain, not the hand of his agent. Velo yad shulucho. The commentaries state that although the halacha is that one must place both hands on the head of the animal, the verse uses a single term yado, meaning his hand. This teaches that one's Canaanite slave or agent cannot perform placing of the hand on one's behalf, and that's from the Rambam on Leviticus 1:4. V'lo yado ishto, but not the hand of his wife. This refers to a woman's ability to place her hands on the head of an offering on behalf of her husband. It parallels exclusions of a Canaanite slave and agent who seek to act on behalf of his master and the one who appointed him respectively. With regard to her own offering, a woman is excluded due to the verses speak to the children of Israel, Bnei Yisrael, and he shall place his hand, Leviticus 1:2-4. Since the term Bnei Yisrael can also mean sons of Israel, this term serves to exclude women from placing hands. in condition 36a. Some commentaries maintain that the discussion in the Gemara here also concerns whether a woman is excluded from placing her hands on her own offering with Beinu Baruch. The Gemara asks, why do I need all these three exclusions? The Gemara explains that all three mentions are necessary. As had the merciful one written only one exclusion, I would say that it serves to exclude only a Canaanite slave. But since he is not commanded in mitzvot, it is reasonable that he cannot perform the right of placing hands. But with regard to an agent, since he is commanded in mitzvot, and there is a principle that the halachic state of a person's agent is like that of himself, shaluchot shel adam b'kamoso. The halachic state of a person's agent is considered like that of a person himself in all respects. Nevertheless, an agent cannot be appointed for the performance of a transgression, and one cannot appoint an agent to perform any mitzvah that requires performance by one's own body. Number Sefer Kinin Hilchos Shluchim V'Yitofim 1:1 Shulchan Aruch Choshen Mitzvot 182:1. One might say that he could place his hand on the offering of the owner on the owner's behalf, and thereby fulfill the requirement. Therefore, it is necessary to have an independent source to exclude an agent. And had the merciful one taught us only these two halachot, one would have excluded only a Canaanite slave and an agent, but they are not considered like his own flesh. But with regard to his wife, who is considered like his own flesh, one might say that she places her hand on her husband's offering. The suggestion here is that even in a case where agency is infected, a wife should be able to act on her husband's behalf, and she is considered like his flesh. In fact, there are cases where an agent cannot act on behalf of one who appointed him, and yet one's spouse can act on the other's behalf. Each husband can request of a sage to nullify his wife's vow. See the Ran on the Dom 8b, Rambam Sefer Aflah, Hilchos Shuvat 6:4. Husband offering. Therefore, the third mention is necessary to teach that even a wife cannot fulfill the requirement on behalf of her husband. The Mishnah states the requirement of placing hands is a non-essential mitzvah. The sage is taught in a Baraita, and he shall place his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to effect atonement for him. Leviticus 1:4. The Baraita asks, but does the right of placing hands affect atonement? Isn't atonement effected only through the presentation of blood? Let us say with regard to blood, for the soul of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to effect atonement for your souls, where it is the blood of the soul that affects atonement. Leviticus 17:11. Rather, the verse serves to say to you that if one treated placing hands as though it were a non-essential mitzvah, and therefore neglected to perform it, then the verse ascribes him blame as though he did not effect atonement, but nevertheless, in actuality, the offering atones for his sin, and he does not need to bring another offering. And it is taught in a Baraita with regard to waving in this way: he shall take one male lamb as a guilt offering to be waved to effect atonement for him. Leviticus 14:21. Later, as does waving the offering effect atonement? Is an atonement effected only through the presentation of blood? And it is stated, for it is the blood of the soul that affects atonement, in Leviticus 17:11. Well, the verse serves to say to you that if one treated waving as though it were a non-essential mitzvah, and therefore neglected to perform it, then the verse ascribes him blame as though he did not effect atonement. But nevertheless, in actuality, the offering affects atonement for his sin, and he does not need to bring another offering. The Mishnah further states that the placing hands is performed by leaning on the head of the offering. The sages taught in a Baraita the phrase "his hand upon his head" meant to be found in Leviticus chapter 3. Each mention expounded to exclude the possibility of performing the rite on a different part of the animal's body. Placing hands is performed with his hand upon his head in Leviticus 3:2, but not with his hand on the neck of the animal, with his hand upon the head, 3:8, but not with his hand on the back of the animal, with his hand upon the head, Leviticus 3:13, but not with his hand on the breast of the animal. The Gemara asks, why do I need all of these three exclusions? The Gemara explains that all three mentions are necessary, as had the merciful one written only one exclusion, I would say that it serves to exclude only the animal's neck, but as not the level with the head of the animal. But with regard to its back, which is the level of its head, one might say that it is not precluded, and that one can fulfill the requirement by placing one's hands there. Therefore, it is necessary to have an independent source to exclude the animal's back. And had the Torah taught us only these two halachot, one would have excluded only the neck and the back. Those parts are not included in the waving of the offering, i.e. they are not waved. With regard to the animal's breath, which is included in the waving of the offering, one can say that it is not precluded, and that one can fulfill the requirement by placing one's hands there. Therefore, the third mention is necessary to teach that placing hands cannot be performed even on the animal's breath. The dilemma was raised before the sages. If one places his hand on the side of the animal's head, what is halacha? Does one fulfill the requirement of placing hands by doing so? The Gemara answers, come here, as is taught in a Baraita, Abba Beria, in the Hebrew, Abba Bera'ah. Who's that? The very name of the sage from every source is uncertain. It's probable that he is called by his place of origin Beria, which is near Safad. It is also unclear whether he was actually the son of Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov or Miriam Tana, who learned in his house of study. The more that appears here is the only one cited in his name in either the Babylonian Talmud or Jerusalem Talmud. So Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says at the verse, and he shall place his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, Leviticus 1:4, indicates it must be done with his hand on the top of his head and not with his hand on the sides of his head. Rabbi Yirmiyah raised a dilemma. If one's hands were wrapped in a cloth, what is the halacha as to whether the cloth is regarded as an interposition between his hands and the animal, such that it invalidates the right? The Gemara answers, common here a resolution from a Baraita which states, the right is valid provided that there is no item that interposes between him and the offering. The Mishnah adds that the placing of hands is performed with two hands. The Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? Reish Lakish said, as it states with regard to the Yom Kippur service, and Aaron shall place both his hands, Yadav, upon the head of the live goat, Leviticus 16:21. The word Yadav, meaning his hands, is written without a second Yod, and so if read without vowels it reads as his hand, but it is also written both, which makes clear that the intention is that he must use both of his hands. This establishes a paradigm in any place where it is stated in the Torah his hand, there are here two hands, unless the verse explicitly specifies there is only one. The Gemara relates, Rabbi Elazar went to take the halacha in the study hall, but he did not say in the name of Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish heard about it and became angry. He said to Rabbi Elazar, if it enters your mind that wherever it is written, his hand, the meaning is that there are actually two hands, then why do I ever need the Torah to write his hands, i.e. Adam in the plural, which it does on numerous occasions? Reish Lakish raised objections against it from 24 occasions where the Torah writes his hands. For example, his hands Yadav shall bring the offerings of the Lord, Leviticus 7:30. His hands Yadav shall contend for him, and you shall be a help against his adversaries, Deuteronomy 33:7. Guiding his hands Yadav willingly from Menachot was the firstborn in Genesis 48:14. Elazar was silent, and he had no response. After Reish Lakish had come down, he said to Rabbi Elazar, what is the reason that you did not say to me the following? When I established that paradigm, I was speaking only about the terms his hands Yadav with regard to placing hand, but with regard to Allah halachot, when the Torah says his hand, the reference is just one hand, and when referring to two hands, it must say his hands. The Gemara asks, but also with regard to placing hands, it is written concerning Moshe's ordination of Joshua, when he placed his hands Yadav upon him and gave him a charge, in Numbers 27:23, using the plural his hands Yadav instead of his hand Yodo. It will clarify to Reish Lakish meant that one could say, when I established that paradigm, I speak only about the term his hands Yadav with regard to placing hands on the animal offering. In all the cases, the intention is that there are two hands of plural must be used. The Mishnah teaches, and in the same location in the temple that one places hands, one slaughters the animal, and immediately following the rite of placing hands, the slaughter is performed. Thus, what is the Mishnah saying? The Mishnah appears to say two distinct rulings, but if so, the first statement is superfluous, because if the slaughter immediately follows the placing of hands, then it is obvious that the animal is slaughtered without changing its location. The Gemara explains that this is what the Mishnah is saying. In the same location in the temple that one places hands, one slaughters the animal, because immediately following the rite of placing hands, the slaughter is performed. There are not two distinct rulings, rather the second statement is the explanation of the first. Mishnah, there is an aspect of greater stringency with regard to placing hands than there is with regard to waving, and there is an aspect of greater stringency with regard to waving than there is with regard to placing hands. The stringency with regard to placing hands that if several people are partners in bringing an offering, one of them waves the offering on behalf of all the other partners, cannot fulfill the requirement of placing hands if he alone places his hands on behalf of the other partners. Rather, each man must place his hands himself. The stringency with regard to waving is that the waving is practiced in cases of both offerings of an individual, e.g. peace offerings where the breast and thigh and sacrificial portions are waved, and in the cases of communal offerings, e.g. the 2 lambs sacrificed in Shavuot, which are waved together with the 2 loaves. I'll just go into the next argument and finish this little paragraph. And this is practiced both in cases of offerings when they are alive, e.g. the guilt offerings of a leper and the lambs of Shavuot, and in the cases of offerings after they are slaughtered, e.g. the breast and thigh. By contrast, placing hands is practiced with a live animal. A third stringency is that waving is practiced both in the case of an item in which there is a living spirit, i.e. the animal offering, and in the case of an item in which there is not a living spirit, e.g. the Omer offering, the certain meal offering, and the loaves accompanying a thanks offering, and the ram of a Nazarite, whereas placing hands is only ever performed upon living beings. Thank you for listening, and I wish you all the best, and peace in Israel. Bye.